Next, we're going to go right into the next panel, challenges to operating the NAS, implementing emerging technologies. It's one of those things that it's going to impact us in this career field for a long, long time. In the air traffic career field, whether you're a controller, developing new technology, or whatever your role is, it's going to impact us. So I think it's a very timely discussion. And with that, I would like to introduce my good friend Hassan Shahidi, Director of Safety and New Entrant Integration from MITRE. He's somebody that I've worked with for years on safety programs and Partnership for Safety, ATSAP, SIAS, you name it, we've been working on it. So with that, thanks, Hassan.
Thank you, Steve. And let me first take a moment to congratulate NATCA for once again putting together a world-class safety conference. I've been coming to this for many years, and it gets better and better. So can we take a moment right now to thank Trish and Paul for their leadership and vision for putting this together. And we have an excellent panel. Speaking of world-class, it is a world-class panel that Steve and I are fortunate to be moderating this morning with lively discussions. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve at this point.
With that, we do have a great panel, but before that, don't forget, we're going to try to be as interactive as we can with the slido.com, hashtag NATCA-CFS. So if you have a question, we're going to be watching that and trying to bring your questions in as soon as we can into the discussion. But with that, could you please play the video?
It is not time to rest on our accomplishments of yesterday, and it is not time to let complacency set in. Together we will grow aviation and allow new users the access into our airspace in a safe, methodical, logical way.
Okay, fantastic. So let's introduce our panel. I'll start out with Eric Stallmer, President, Commercial Spaceflight Federation.
And next we have Paul McDuffie, Business Development Executive from Boeing Horizon X.
Vinny Capezzuto, Chief Technology Officer and Vice President, Aireon.
And then who doesn't know Trish Gilbert, NACA's Executive Vice President.
We have Lori Garver, General Manager with ALPA.
And Kelvin Coleman, Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation in the FAA.
So as we just saw in the video, there's so many amazing technologies being introduced, from commercial space flights with boosters that return back to Earth in a precision landing, to all sorts of drones flying in the airspace for different missions, both public and commercial, to satellite technologies that will transform the way in which air traffic control is done, to these autonomous balloons that fly at very high altitudes. All these technologies are here on this panel. We'll this morning have a robust conversation about these technologies and the benefits, as well as the challenges that are out there to integrate these into our national airspace system. So with that, Let me just start out with this first segment, which will just be level setting. Each panelist will provide some remarks and perspectives. And so we will start with Eric.
Great. Thank you so much, Hassan, and thank you, Steve. And thank you all for having me and the rest of the panel today. This is an extremely impressive crowd and a great organization. Someone that flies over 100,000 miles a year. I certainly appreciate the work that you guys do getting everyone to their destination safely. So it's a great honor to be here. I would like to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the commercial space industry, because right now we're really finding ourselves at the golden age of space. The second golden age, of course, because of obviously the Apollo era, but that was 50 years ago. But what we're seeing today is an incredible rise in the amount of launches that are taking place, innovation that's taking place, investment into the aerospace community. And it's really going to change the dynamics of the way we do business, the way we operate, and the way you guys have to do your job. Last year, I think we had about 25 commercial launches. I think this year we'll have over 30 commercial launches. It doesn't sound like a huge number, but it has a very big impact on day-to-day operations in the national airspace. I would also say, I've gotten a great education about the national airspace and its limitations and the opportunities this past year. In February, a couple things came to head. One, a tremendous technological breakthrough with the Falcon Heavy launch vehicle that took off, I think, February 5th. And it was just amazing what they did. Bring in a new rocket, a new launch vehicle to market in such a short amount of time, all privately funded, returning the boosters back to Earth after the launch took place. But also it created a little bit of angst with the amount of airspace that had to be closed, the amount of time that had to be closed, and the whole area that had to be closed. And it got a lot of people scratching their heads. When it was just the shuttle going up, no one had any problems with that. It was God and country, and it was a national mission. But now you have commercial companies that are making money and are to some would say, disrupting the airspace. And what we realized is we had to have a conversation about this growing market, because it's not going to get smaller. The industry, all indications are that the industry is only going to continue to grow. And so we got together, it was the space people, but also the aviation community. And I got to say that we didn't talk well to the aviation community well. We talked, to the tower, to the launch control, range control when we had to launch, and we'd say what our parameters was, and we got a license from Kelvin's people down at FAA, and then we launched. And but now, as we're doing this more and more, it's creating, as I said, a little bit of a disruption. But the dialogue has to happen, because I think now, as we evolve, there's technologies and tools that are out there that can help assist in the national airspace, so we can all continue to grow. And we've had this conversation with the air traffic controllers, with ALPA, with A4A, and we all kind of came together and are trying to educate each other on how do we best integrate the airspace. It's not as much of a prioritization, and certainly we understand the role that the airlines and the aviation community play with over 40,000 flights a day. But how do we, from the commercial launch industry, get everyone involved? And so that's, it's been a challenge, but it's also been eye-opening, and it's great symmetry of working together with our different organizations. So there's that aspect going on. There's also spaceports. Everyone thinks of space launches taking place from Florida or out in California, but now there's 11 federally licensed spaceports across the country. One recently came up in outside of Denver. It was Front Range Airport and the Colorado Spaceport, and they applied for a license. And that also raised some red flags in people in the aviation community. Why in the world would you put a spaceport? Why would you be launching rockets 5 miles away from, or a few miles away from one of the busiest airports in the country. And it was an education on what the role of that spaceport is, what's going to be launched there, and what this means to have a spaceport license. It's I love the animation of the Jetsons, and I would love to see the day when that we're near there, but we're not there yet. So, but we have to get that message out. I'd also say there's a great amount of interest from a policy perspective, not just from the Congress and Senate, but the White House. And the White House recently created the National Space Council, which is meeting today, and they're putting forth a lot of initiatives that can help and Administrator Elwell talked about this a little earlier, that can help streamline how we launch, how we re-enter, how we go through all the processes, but at the same time working together with our colleagues in the aviation industry. But it's going to be a very, very exciting time. I think everything that you saw taking off vertically in those videos all are our companies. And they're, in the next 6 to 8 months, you're going to see 4 new human-rated launch systems come online here in the US. That's incredible. You have 2 that are going to go suborbital, that are going to resupply the International Space Station, and 2 that are going to be taking passengers up into space, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. So as exciting as that is, and I am thrilled about it, it presents challenges, and safety is one of the most paramount of those challenges, and the most important, I would think, of creating these business models. So I would keep your eyes on what's going on in the commercial space industry. It's going to be exciting. We want to engage you. We're partners. We're not competitors or anything like that. And I think what you guys are doing is just outstanding work on keeping the national airspace safe. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Eric. And Paul, you've been a leader in the UAS area for a number of years. So we're interested in your remarks, and also about these flying taxis. If you could talk about that a little bit too.
Sure. Well, thank you, Hassan and Steve, for allowing me to join this steer group. It's an impressive crowd, and you're certainly very important to us as we advance this technology. I work for a group at Boeing that you may or may not have heard of, because we're relatively young in terms of the enterprise standard. It's called Horizon X, and it's a group of very entrepreneurial-minded, young, aggressive-thinking people. I'm the old guy in the group with the gray hair. Most of the folks in Horizon X have never seen a Jetsons cartoon. However, we've told them about it, and they like the idea. And as such, much of the focus of the Horizon X team at Boeing is revolving around the development of urban air mobility. And I'll talk a little bit about that throughout the morning. Horizon X is an aggressive, as I said, entrepreneurial group that goes out and makes investments and works on developing technology that are considered disruptive. Disruptive to the core business of the Boeing company, and certainly disruptive to the aviation community as it currently exists. What motivates us to move into this area? Well, if you really kind of look at some of the statistics that have come across us over the past year or so, it's kind of interesting. If you look back, in 1950, about 450 million people lived in urban areas. At the present time, over 4 billion people live in urban areas. Average commute times globally have run anywhere, well, let me correct that, about 25% of commute times now globally run about 90 minutes or longer. In the US, the average commute time has gone from, in 1980, roughly 20 minutes to nearly 30 minutes in 2016. Something's got to change. In order to build additional infrastructure, we're talking about millions of dollars per mile to build rail lines, roadways, et cetera, to help move this mass of people in urban areas to places that they want to go. So much of what is going to happen is going to be transformative. It's transformative from an aviation standpoint, and it's going to be transformative from a society standpoint. But the challenges are vast. There's no question about it. Horizon X and the Boeing team is absolutely committed to developing the technologies and working with you, working with the regulators, not only here in the US, but globally, to solve basically the significant challenges that are going to enable routine use of urban mobility kinds of assets. Our definition of urban mobility goes beyond what the Jetsons had. We look not only at personal air transportation, but to support tourism and also freight carriage, common carriage of property for compensation or hire, which means essentially we're talking about partnering with the traditional freight carriers, doing last mile delivery of cargo in densely populated urban areas, all of which will, of course, reduce the burden on the current ground infrastructure and hopefully at a reduced cost. We're currently developing a number of technologies to support that. We've invested about, well, I won't give you the number, but about 17 different companies are now considered investment partners. We're looking at a number of joint ventures with some of them to actually grow some of this technology and move forward. We're doing a lot of research and testing on eVTOL, electric-powered vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. We're doing that in partnership with a number of existing operations, specifically those that are interested in aerial ride sharing. And you might guess who that is. You've probably heard Uber Elevate has significant interest in this technology. We've engaged with them and are looking at some viable solutions going forward. But clearly, in order to make this happen, three things have to happen. We've got to solve the economic problems, make sure that whatever we do with this technology, we have the ability to close a business case and the business that we create is completely scalable, that the technologies, in fact, are developed, the data about their success, their safety, their reliability is gathered and assessed very, very clearly, and that it makes good economic sense. So we're working toward that. We are aggressively moving in that direction. We are in a kind of what we call a test and learn phase right now. You're going to see some things coming out of our group over the next year to 18 months with some of our partners where we're actually going to be live virtual constructive testing and evaluating some of this technology and determining where the risks are, how to appropriately mitigate them and move this technology forward. So it's an exciting time. You're going to be a major component in this discussion, I am sure, and I look forward in the future to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Talking about transformation, Vinny, Aireon's been busy with a lot of transformation types of activities with satellite-based ADS-B, so please take it away.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, NATCA, for inviting me. I really look forward to the participation here and afterwards, hopefully, with the dialogue with everyone here. It's always a pleasure reconnecting with everyone. It's kind of like coming to home week. So Aireon, small company, basically taking advantage of an upgrade to the Iridium infrastructure, satellites that were put in at the end of the 90s. They reached the end of their life cycle. They were redesigning the new version of it and wanted to add something more to it. So they created Aireon, where we're deploying ADS-B receivers on every one of those satellites. So they're 480 miles above the Earth. There's currently 60 of them with brand new ADS-B receivers on them. And when you look at the booth outside, you'll see the data that we've been collecting. So if you walk, as soon as you walk out the door, you can see that we've been showing off. It's pre-operational. We still have another launch to go at the end of December. That'll complete the constellation, which would consist of 66 operational satellites and 9 spares. And then we continue to keep 6 spares on the ground for replenishment over the life cycle of providing the service. So it's kind of exciting, and if you think about it, yes, it's new, but it's not, right? So you kind of talk about what are the implementing emerging technologies. October 2000, the AS-DX contract was signed between the FAA and Census, and I hear people still talking about making changes to it and working with it. But I would tell you, hidden underneath the word AS-DX was multilateration and ADS-B, not just radar, and fusion. And those same things, those same concepts kind of merged further in life because in 2007, the FAA awarded a contract for ADS-B, and how were they going to put that on ERAM, STARS? They had to introduce fusion. So now you have all this nice, great multi-sensor capability, and I know there's challenges with the implementation, but look how many years it's taking to go from the point of award of a contract to where you're really looking at it as a key component of your everyday life and how you're serving the traffic in the airspace. So I think some of those challenges are about how can you shorten the time? How can you get there faster? And I heard Dan talk about it earlier. Reauthorization's a big deal. And the challenge about not having stable funding obviously conflicts with trying to bring in new technologies. There's a lot of competition with all the different new entrants trying to make their way into the scene. And the other challenge is, do you ever remove anything? And if you ran your household like this, you'd be broke. So there's these, I guess, conflicts and emotions that come into the decision making. Paul mentioned the economic analysis, and a lot of trouble is taken to develop these beautiful business cases, but at the end of the day, they don't really hold together over the test of time. So what are you going to do? How do we take this on? And I think there has to be different business models. I think industry is prepared to step in and step up and partner. I think Aireon's a pretty good example of taking all the risk, acquiring the loans, developing the technology, but not doing it in a vacuum. We've had a relationship with the FAA from day one. And that was an important relationship because it was understood you can't deploy this capability without talking to the people who you wish will use it. And it's not just the FAA, but globally, we have 11 other customers signed up. And I mean, this is a really important step about inclusion and making sure that you have the opportunity to fix or build the system so that the users understand its purpose. And I mentioned ASDX earlier, and I mentioned ADS-B earlier, and we can talk about ERAM as well. All those had work groups. All those had in the Article 48 before it was 114 and 114. All of those had it, and those are your successful programs. And they're successful because they had people participating, challenging, debating. I like the word collaboration, and I've always said if it's not painful, then you're not collaborating. So it really comes down to building systems and leveraging from industry their ability to provide the funds, take on some of the risk, and share in some of the benefits in the long haul. And all Aireon's doing is taking ADS-B as you know it, ground stations, and just deploying it on satellites in space. The difference is, I think it's truly a game changer in regards to whatever is good for the United States is good for the rest of the world, and this data is available globally. And so countries that are challenged with infrastructure no longer are going to have that challenge. And for the FAA, I think, who has a very resilient infrastructure, this could help. In the case of oceanic, it definitely offers new opportunities. In the case of terrestrial, it certainly is a place where I think it could add benefit and fill in the gaps. Everyone knows they have a gap somewhere in their facility. I'm sure you talk to anyone, they'll say, I wish I had surveillance in that area. And I know it's not a silver bullet. I mean, we recognize that it's comm, nav, and surveillance. It's the package. It's one of the pieces of the package. And using space, using rockets to get it up there was just a new medium for me and exciting. And participating with SpaceX as the deliverer of our satellites and learning about that side of the business is very exciting. And it also just points out, the FAA's been depending on this for years. GPS was put up years ago. And modifications and revisions are being made to it as we speak. And the world ticks on GPS, and there's no doubt about it. I saw a question up there about vulnerability, and I think it's a very good question, and you're right, you have to be prepared. You can't have the silver bullet. You can't be one item only that's going to kind of fix everything. There's no such thing. It's about having tools in the toolbox. It's about having distributed networks and surveillance sensors and comm backups. That's what will make it work. So Aireon's excited to be here. I look at it as implementing emerging technologies. I've had the pleasure of doing that in the FAA, and now I have the pleasure of doing it outside of the FAA. The call to duty is implementing, not talking about it, not shelfware. It's about getting it in the NAS. It's about using it and having people brag about it later, 18 years later. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Vinny. So there you have it. all these new technologies and capabilities here and coming our way, and so are the air traffic controllers and pilots ready? And so, Trish and Lori, I think your perspectives on this would be really interesting. So, Trish, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me back for 3 more years. I appreciate that. I really. It really has been, the best thing I've been allowed to do, and been an honor to serve and represent the greatest workforces in all of aviation, and not to push the pilots aside, but I think we're a wonderful professional organization, and I'm very proud to be representing you in any capacity that I can. I'm glad the title says challenges, because I don't want to come off as negative. Certainly don't ever want to do that, but there certainly are challenges that we're going to have the conversation about, and that's why this panel is very important. It certainly was said when Paul opened the conference yesterday. I believe the #1 challenge, which is going to tie to everything else that I say, is the funding. If we're not seeing shrinking budgets, we're seeing flat budgets, or we're not seeing budgets that are increasing enough to accommodate the legacy systems, accommodate the day-to-day operations, and then allow for what we need to have take place to introduce the new entrants that are very important, because if we don't do it here in the United States, we watch it occur in other parts of the world, and we don't want to fall behind and have to adapt to what they're doing in the rest of the globe, on the rest of the globe. So the funding certainly is challenging, very positive that we do have an FAA reauthorization bill for 5 years. Unfortunately, we do have a funding bill that is only funding the government and the FAA through December 7th. So again, that is a challenge. I think there is a little bit of misnomer when we do see government shutdowns, what the impacts and effects are to the FAA and the National Airspace System, and certainly the length of those shutdowns do play into what the eventual effects will be. But all of it is problematic. All of it is really an irresponsible way to manage a national airspace system that we all care deeply about and want to see grow and allow new innovation to become a part of it. But we will work through that, as we always have. Directly tied to the funding piece certainly is the resources that we have in the FAA and the ability to not just accomplish the day-to-day operations, but then also have the training and integration that needs to take place, not just with the emerging technologies, but with technologies that are actually decade-old technologies that we're trying to get in our facilities. We are being stretched every which way in a very busy system. Our TRACONs, many of our high-level TRACONs, 11s and 12s, have been working mandatory 6-day work weeks overtime for not just a couple of years, but for a decade. So we are addressing the staffing, working very collaboratively with the agency to keep the academy seats full, to make sure that we're hiring to the maximum capacity that the FAA can, including, in addition to keeping the academy seats full, some experienced bids that have come out to also supplement the hiring and staffing in the air traffic controller ranks, to ensure that we can get our facilities healthy and we can get away from lengthy work weeks, and we can get into a position where we can accomplish the training that we need to have accomplished and the implementation of the new technologies, and pull people from the operation to help on these work groups to collaborate with industry and the FAA. And that's just the air traffic controller ranks. I mean, I can go into Region 10, who also has extreme issues with staffing and lack of resources, and certainly those that we represent in traffic management and flight service, all of it is stretched pretty thin. So all of that is stuff that it's, certainly impossible to get through all of those challenges if we don't collaborate and work together. And it's a very good thing that for the last 10 years or 9 years, that we have been making a great effort to really institute collaboration as the way we do business, because without working together, we certainly wouldn't get through these challenges because they are big. But we need to get through them, and we need to be able to make space for the new innovators, and we need to be able to get our facilities healthy again. So with that, I won't go into it maybe later when we get into the questions about the actual operational challenges, not just with staffing, but with safety and integration with drones, commercial space, and certainly I see one for remote tower technology as well, but we'll get to that.
Okay. Lori, I understand that previously you were Deputy Administrator at NASA, so you bring an interesting perspective to this conversation, and now you're with ALPA, so take it away.
Great, good morning. It is wonderful to be here. It is my first CFS conference, and I am incredibly impressed. I was Deputy Administrator of NASA in the Obama administration. Prior to that, I had run the policy office at NASA and really had a 30-year career on the space side of things. And just over 5 years ago, commercial aviation recruited me away, and one of the reasons actually was because, at least the president of ALPA says now, they saw this merging of technologies and we are going to have to learn from each other. And honestly, being in commercial aviation has shown me so much about the incredible, robust, and impeccable safety record we have, and how are we going to be able to extend that when we have these new emerging technologies in the NAS. So while this panel is supposed to be about challenges, I'm going to leave you with a few opportunities as well. I think that we all know these are challenges, right? New entrants. We've been operating for about 100 years in a system where there hasn't been much change in the vehicles that are flying through the airspace. That is no longer going to be the case, and we know with UAS there are very different challenges. Some are, the smaller hobbyists, remote UAVs. There's large drones in our airspace, remotely operated. Certainly people even talking about commercial jets being remotely operated. We have space launches that are horizontal, that are vertical, that are reusable and returned to the planet. These all are different challenges we're going to have to deal with. So to me, if we don't evolve, we're going to not be able to, in the United States, and Dan talked about this somewhat, be able to have these technologies benefit our country. So to me, we're the big dogs, right? Does anyone think commercial aviation isn't the big dog? ALPA, NATCA, right? We've been around. I go back to NASA, I say, oh, that's so nice. You launched 6 astronauts last year. Oh, our pilots flew 900 million safely just in the United States. It's an incredible thing that commercial aviation does. So how come the Chihuahuas are eating our lunch? How come Dan Elwell comes here and Secretary Chow, they spend most of their time talking to aviation groups about commercial space, about drones, and about supersonic transport? There's a reason. Those are new, those are exciting, and I think we can use this as an opportunity to do what we know we have needed to do. I've been listening to your president talk about the need for modernization of the NAS since I came into the community. Next Gen was something at NASA we're a big part of, but Next Gen has taken too long. These things have taken too long, and we are now, I think, going to have the ability to leverage these new technologies to become safer ourselves with the many more commercial airlines that are going to be flying than just these new entrants. If you look at the slide they showed with all the different new entrants, if that were really a depiction of what we do now, it would be almost black with commercial airlines. So we are still primarily who's going to be operating for, I would argue, decades. And I was a huge proponent of commercial space. One of the things we did in the Obama administration, following what the Bush administration did, were invest in the technologies that would allow commercial space. So I'm a huge fan, and I think NASA, although you might argue their golden years were in the 60s with Apollo, is seeing that resurgence, as Eric mentioned. In aviation, we often think of our golden years around that time as well. Pilots, certainly, everybody grew up wanting to be one, and we have the opportunity, I think, to harness that energy again by embracing these new technologies. So we are, in commercial aviation, over $1 trillion a year benefit to the nation. Commercial space generally is a couple $100 billion, and UAVs is around $85 billion, all growing. So if we get our collective act together, we can argue that we are truly going to be one of the largest economic sectors in the country. But does aviation have an aviation council? There's a space council. The Vice President of the United States is speaking today to the Space Council. This president has put forward 4 new space directives. The Space Force. Is aviation getting this kind of attention? We are not. But we can, because the airspace is our common denominator, and no one wants to do anything to impact safety. We've become, I think, just used to airlines being safe, and we hope we don't have to have a reason to remember just what it is that we're doing in the skies every day. So for the space program, what caused them to change, unfortunately, were a couple of accidents. We lost 14 people, 2 space shuttles out of 135, and we knew we had to do things differently. That ushered in this new golden age. We should not wait for that to happen. So advancing our capability for including new entrants in our system is something that I think we can use to save us at a time when we have, as a nation, become complacent as a people to all our exciting things that we do in the airspace. We need to, as Trish said, use this to get more resources. Those are financial resources. Those are human capital resources. It's very typical now for early career people interested in this kind of thing to go into commercial space or UAVs. One of the things I do is lead a fellowship for collegiate women interested in aviation and space. And we have paid internships from SpaceX, Kitty Hawk, and that's where people want to go. I've been trying to get people, we do it at ALPA, we have interns at ALPA, and they are not as many people wanting to join the classical aviation community as some of these new startups. So if we work together, maybe we could get an association to beat gravity. You know, we all are doing that. We have a common need to share the national airspace, and you are really the common denominator, the managers of this airspace. So how have we done that in the past? How did we get this incredibly safe situation? We work together. We work so closely together, and we cannot stop there. You all are making a big step with this conference. If you look, your panels are largely about these different emerging entrants, and we're getting to know each other as communities. We're not separate. We're never going to be separate anymore. We love our chihuahuas, and we're the big dogs. It's okay. You go to the dog park, and they all play together very nicely. So that's what we have to do. ALPA is taking a leadership position in this, and it's not really because of me. If you know anything about ALPA, we are the pilot-driven, staff-supported, and I'm staff, and the elected pilot leadership has wanted to reach out to the other communities. Of course, we're on the DAC. Of course, we're doing, as Eric said, with the Commercial Space Flight Federation, meetings, policy papers, testimony on the Hill to work together. But I think there's more to be done. I think we should think about how to do that in a more formal way so we can together reach out to the government, the FAA, which also needs to work together better. Part of the opportunity here is to have ATO work more clearly with AST, the part of the FAA that Kelvin is in charge of, as well as the policy department. We need White House leadership for all of it, because as these new entrants get so much attention, we can get attention too, in a very positive way. So we do need to act more like, I think, I'm a competitive person, so I know sometimes it's easy to, fight somebody. So it's a lot of fun. How many people go to the All-Star game and compared to the Super Bowl? Not that many. So I'm going to propose, I'm a buddy of Elon's, and he's a great guy, but maybe we could just band together and say we're going to beat the tunnelers, Hyperloop. Come on, that's got to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Are we really going to transport a bunch of people underground? No, there's a better view up here. Would you rather be a bird or a groundhog? So we have, I think, to be able to take the $1.5 trillion advantage and get investors in our community. They're getting investors in commercial space. They're getting investors in drones, people who want to make money. How much more leverage could we get off the more than $1 trillion in commercial aviation if that investment came here? Are we really not going to upgrade our airports, but we're going to build new tunnels? It makes no sense. So we should get our story out. I think we should do it in a way that is exciting, so we recruit the best new talent, the best diverse new talent, that all the people coming out of the big schools with science technology backgrounds, they want to be birds. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori. Very interesting perspectives. I don't know where to go from here, but Kelvin, you're leading the FAA's Office of Commercial Space, approving Eric's rockets, and so I don't know why you're sitting so far apart. Are you guys friends? Are you?
We had coffee this morning.
Okay. So, Kelvin, if you could just talk about where you are and the offices and where FAA is going.
Well, thank you, Hassan and Steve, and also thank you, Paul and Trish, for the opportunity to be here today. This is a great opportunity to talk about the exciting things that are going on that's already been mentioned by many of the panelists already concerning what we call new entrants in the National Airspace System. And I want to thank all of you, NATCA, the Air Traffic Control Association. Really, because of you, we're able to keep the system safe. And that's, as Administrator Airwell already talked about today, that's our bottom line in the FAA, is to ensure safe operations as we enable new entrants like a UAS, commercial space transportation, into the system. I'm going to pick up a little bit on where Lori left off, if you will, in talking about some of the challenges that we have. Terry Bristol is here, our Chief Operating Officer, and we work very closely with Terry's office to ensure that commercial space transportation is examined closely, to ensure that safety is ensured as new launch operations and vehicles are integrated into the National Airspace System. And that's one of the big priorities for us in the FAA, is how do we integrate new entrants like commercial space transportation operators into the National Airspace System. We put a lot of time and investment into examining this issue, and it's not a new issue, quite frankly. I've been with the agency for almost 20 years now, and when I first started, I was talking to someone earlier in the hallway, we were talking about NASA integration 20 years ago. And the problems of 20 years ago are the same problems that we're seeing today, and as Eric already mentioned, it's a thing whereas, well, hey, listen, if it's NASA or if it's DOD, hey, we get it, and we'll all wave the flag and we'll all support that. But hey, if it's a commercial operator with a commercial satellite making a profit in competition, if you will, with the airlines, hey, why do we have to give ground, if you will, and accommodate or prioritize those operations above, if you will, aviation operations? And so 20 years ago to the present, same issue, same challenges, as I think Lori already mentioned. And so our office is really responsible for licensing these chihuahuas, as you alluded to. And we license companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, United Launch Alliance, who are seeking to take advantage and to deliver products and services to space that benefit the United States and our economic interests, as well as our national security interests. The Space Shuttle retired in 2001, and since that time, commercial companies have taken up the gauntlet, if you will, to deliver products and services to the International Space Station, and soon they will be delivering NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, and thus taking us away from reliance on the Russians, if you will, to deliver us to the International Space Station. So that's great. The commercial space transportation industry is really playing a significant role and part in that. As Administrator Dan Elwell mentioned earlier, we had a record-breaking year last year in terms of the number of operations that we licensed. 32 launch operations in the U.S., 3 reentry operations, and this fiscal year we expect to break that record again. We expect over 40 operations in fiscal year 19, and looking ahead to fiscal year 20, more than 60. So we have our work cut out for us. And so we haven't been asleep at the wheel, if you will. We've set up a couple of different rulemaking committees, one looking at this issue of NASA integration. In particular, we're looking at ways to better integrate these operations in the National Airspace System, looking at technologies and what priorities should we place on technology investment, procedures, policies, et cetera. We're also looking at spaceports. How do we better integrate spaceports into the National Airspace System? We have 11 licensed spaceports in the U.S. currently. And still, most of the operations from these spaceports are from Florida and California. But as Eric mentioned, we have new spaceports popping up in places that they haven't popped up before, like Colorado, where you have a spaceport at Front Range that's 5 miles away from one of the busiest airports in the country. And so while we stood that up and licensed that, one of the major questions was, well, how do we make this all work together and ensure that the equities of both the aviation community and the commercial space transportation industry are appropriately addressed? And so I think it's a question of not can we do it, but how do we do it? And that's what our challenges are today. And I think communicating on safety and communicating on these issues is really the right way to go. So I really applaud NATCA for having this forum to talk about these issues because it's really important. And as already mentioned again, as we speak, the National Space Council is meeting in DC right now as we speak, and Secretary Chow is giving a very important update on one of the major initiatives that we've undertaken to streamline our launch and reentry regulations for commercial space transportation. And so what does that mean with streamlined launch and reentry regulations? Well, that means that launch and reentry operators who are very innovative will have, if you will, an easier way to go in terms of getting licenses from the FAA. We're not going to compromise on safety, but we're going to take out some of the burdensome prescriptive regulations that we have in place and replace those prescriptive regulations with performance-based regulations, allowing innovation to thrive for U.S. companies. And so we're going to see more space, not less of it. And so this is a big challenge that's set before us in terms of how do we integrate these operations in the National Airspace System. So I applaud NATCA and your work, first and foremost, for keeping the system safe. Without your contributions, without your help, this doesn't work at all. So you've done a great job. I want to thank you for that. But we have our work cut out for you, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about how do we come together as a community and make this all work.
Thanks, Kelvin. We really appreciate and all the panelists for giving us your perspective of what's going on in these areas. We talked about UAS space, space ADS-B, commercial space. One of the technologies that's coming out that we keep hearing about is remote towers. And there's a question up here that's been here since the beginning of the panel. And I'd like to get Trish is probably the best suited to answer this on the panel, but certainly anybody can jump in. But what's the status of remote towers and what is their role in the NAS?
So, you know, we did the testing out at Leesburg, which is a tower in Virginia that runs over 100,000 operations a year without air traffic control services or a tower there. So they did the remote tower testing in a room there on the airport. We got a lot of data from that. Certainly, we have concerns with regard to that specific piece of technology, but we have visited other areas in Sweden specifically, not myself, but some of our team, to look at different systems. And the technology is improving and evolving and is coming. So there is not going to be, it's going to come. So we'll just leave it at that. And after that, Fort Collins now is starting to set up and do some testing in Colorado on the technology. It's interesting dynamic that we have in the United States that's different than probably most of the rest of the world, is that we have thousands of airports in the United States that are uncontrolled or no air traffic services at all. So our perspective is, if this technology allows us to provide services where there are none, then that enhances safety. And that is a different perspective than I think a lot of our colleagues in other countries have, because they provide service almost every entity that flies in their country. So that's where we are. We're still in the testing phases. There's a lot of different partners or vendors out there, you know, working on the technology, and it is constantly evolving and improving.
Thanks. Anybody else have anything to add? Because there's a couple of really good questions, and I think something that maybe everybody can provide some input into is the second one down, and it says, it's how does the FAA expect to keep up with the new technological demands of the NAS, considering the current lack of predictable funding, inadequate staffing, and slow implementation of next gen? And Kelvin, do you want to start? And then
well, I'm the FAA guy here. Well, I think, you know, as Dan mentioned, we just got a reauthorization that's going to give us some stability over the next few years, and I think we're working very hard to make sure that we're keeping up with the demands of not only the commercial space transportation sector, but also the commercial aviation and general aviation users who take advantage of the services that we provide in the National Airspace System. We have some significant challenges ahead of us, certainly in the commercial space transportation arena. I'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, as we see flyback boosters, horizontal launch operations, vertical launch operations from different locations, we're seeing an increasing demand for our products and services that we've had a struggle, quite frankly, keeping up with in times past. But as already mentioned by Dan Elwell, we've had a significant increase through the reauthorization. At least the authorizers have sought out a significant increase for our funding over the next few years, which will help us bring in the necessary resources, invest in the necessary technologies that will keep pace with the demands for our products and services. So I think there's a positive outlook that we have in terms of being able to keep pace with what we're seeing coming forward.
So I would add that my answer to this is we're not going to keep up with the new technologies without change, without more resources. Obviously, what we're doing is segregating the airspace now. So we're going to keep doing that until there are new tools to be able to tell us where these things are in the airspace and where they're going to be. That's coming, but not fast enough, and so we need to invest in those capabilities. The space community doesn't know much about our system, and we don't know much about them. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that will help, but it's inadequate to do anything but segregate. And on the ALPA side, 100% safety is, we cannot risk that for our 1 billion passengers a year. So we can have tools that can shrink the amount of time and the amount of space maybe that needs to be segregated through these new tools, but full modernization will be necessary before there's full integration. And that's going to take a lot of resources, so we need to find ways to get those. NASA has a $20 billion a year budget. We don't, the highway bills, $90 billion. We need to make our case. We are contributing more to the economic benefit of this nation than any of those communities, yet the federal government does not recognize that. So if we work together and show that, we can maybe start to get the resources and predictable funding, growing funding, that will be needed to do this.
Eric, you had wanted to say
One thing I was going to add really quickly is a couple of years back, Congressman Jim Bridenstine made a real conscious effort to help plus up the FAA's Office of Commercial Space's budget. And prior to that, I thought the Office of Commercial Space was the only office at the FAA. So that's a joke, I know, there's others there. But he really went to bat to plus up this office. Now that congressman is the administrator of NASA and is sitting at the table today with the National Space Council, and I think he understands the bigger picture. I think he understands the partnership, the relationship within the NAS and the players, and I hope he will be a champion on that level, you know, working to advance these funding requirements that we're going to have, because we have to prioritize, you know, where this money is going to go, especially with all this new technology out there.
There are some technological investments we're making. So one of the tools that we're investing in is something called Space Data Integrator, and we've been working in close collaboration with the Air Traffic Organization on this tool for a number of years now, and it's now becoming ripe. And so what this tool will enable us to do is, with more preciseness, understand where these vehicles are in the NAS, what the health of these vehicles are. And with this greater preciseness and better awareness of the vehicle's health and where it is located in the NAS, we'll be able to be less conservative, we believe, in our allocation of airspace, both in terms of amount of airspace that's allocated, as well as the time that airspace is allocated to support these launches. And so we're making some investments here in technologies. There's also technologies such as the hazardous risk assessment module, we call it HRAM, that allow us more in real time, if there is a accident or a mishap with the vehicle in the airspace, we'll in real time be able to understand where those pieces of debris are, and more quickly, if you will, move aircraft away from those hazards. And so those are some of the investments that we're making in the FAA, perhaps not as fast as we would like, but we're making good, steady progress on those, and we expect to see those come online pretty soon.
Trish?
Yeah, so a couple of things. It's good to hear that there is an investment made in some technology that will allow us to better, right now we're blocking a tremendous amount of airspace for this work, and we are accommodating and segregating, and we're not integrating. And until we're able to fully provide the resources, we won't see integration, because we need to do it safely. I think everybody agrees safety is #1 priority. The interesting thing to me is, and I think the most frustrating part, is that we do have a 5-year FAA reauthorization bill with a good set of priorities, things that I think we all could stand behind. The frustrating part is, while those priorities are set by the authorizers in Congress, there is not a mirrored funding bill to accommodate that authorization bill. So you would think that they would work together and they say, okay, these are the things we expect the FAA to do and the aviation industry to do, and then here is the funding to get that done. That doesn't occur like that, and that makes it very, very challenging. The last piece of the point I wanted to make is I do sit on the Drone Advisory Committee, and I do see some of the things occurring with regard to commercial space around allowing those new entrants to use the airspace in a more efficient, effective way by looking at the prescriptive regulations and the performance of the vehicles versus the traditional way that we bring technology into the FAA, which takes a very long time. And maybe the question is not for you, and maybe it's just something for the administrator and Terry, who have both gone now. Are we going to get to a point where the rest of the FAA, as we bring in technologies that we need today to do our job, a more robust way of doing it, like we are seeing getting accomplished with drones in commercial space? And I don't know if you can answer that. They are gone, but it's just something to think about. We're starting to evolve in our bureaucracy of being less bureaucratic with these new users and not evolving that same way with the stuff that we need to do the day-to-day operation, is the point I want to make.
Yeah.
I think it might, and I'll get to you, Paul, but I think it might be an interesting perspective to hear from Vinny on this, because he has both perspectives, right? He went from government and now industry, and how do you see this kind of playing out?
Yeah, I think starting right from the start is policy, right? I mean, it's the biggest, I think it's the blocker, or it could be the enabler. And what I'm talking about is a combinations of things. It's public-private partnerships that should be taken advantage of. I love what Governor Cuomo's doing with trying to build the tunnel. Sorry to say that, but I mean, he is going all out to demonstrate that you can't do it alone. You've got to pool funds from different resources to do these large-scale projects. And these are very important large-scale projects to our economy, and you can't ignore it. And so you start with the public-private partnership, you know, taking advantage of working closely with the industry base. I think the other component of it is the acquisition management system. It was put out in 1996. It is flexible. It is great. It has done great things, but it takes people with the guts to take the risk and to look at things differently. So you mentioned traditional, so they call it the V model when you implement a new system, right? And it's a standard systems engineering process to put something in. Well, they have the new way of doing things, and it's not that new. It's called agile. And I see it side by side in what we do. I have some groups that work on certain things the traditional way and some groups doing it with the agile. And what agile does is it gets it out quick. It gets out a small component of it. It gets the users to quickly give you feedback, and you iterate on it, and you run these quick sprints, and you basically deploy faster, and you get the buy-in immediately. So you're stepping in with the user. You're not doing these long, drawn-out design reviews that take years to get the technology. This is published methodology that I don't see embraced in all the approaches that are being taken for how you put something in a NAS today. So there's those opportunities. And then the last component in my mind is, how do you change the culture of the people that are there to incorporate this, right? You're not going to bolt safety on later. You can't. You can, but it's going to be cost prohibitive, right? And it's just not, it hurts, right? So why not build it in up front? And a lot of that is when you do those agile attempts, you should have the users participating again so that you're getting that rapid feedback, but you're also governed by standards of safety, your target level of safety. It's something you're aiming for. You're designing in from day one. All those should actually accelerate deployment. All those should actually put in a service or system that meets the needs almost like right out of the box. And there's demonstrated programs that have done this. I get a little frustrated because it's kind of like you're dealing with turning this large ship around, and it's hard to change that culture because you need leadership, and the leadership needs to be sustained. And that's a different model. And Paul and Trish, you are an example of sustained leadership. And that does not always get enjoyed in the federal government. Let's just say it that way, right? You get rapid turnover of executives that are essentially aren't going to be there to carry through with the vision. So you got to have the vision, but you got to have the people that are going to execute. You need both. And I think those are some of the areas I see as places for improvement.
Thanks, Vinny. Paul, you had wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, I think, in many discussions with my FAA friends over the years, I think there's a clear acknowledgement on their part that the solutions to the impact of NAS integration of autonomous systems doesn't lie within the agency. The solutions are going to come from industry, and I can speak from the industry standpoint that, clearly we're poised to make investments in the solution set for this. I'm sure Vinny would agree as well. The estimates over the next 40 years that this is a $500 billion industry may not be that far off. And we certainly believe that it's the role of industry to be an active partner with FAA, that we're going to be the investment partner in a lot of cases to actually solve a lot of these issues. And don't forget, this is not an issue that is germane only to the U.S. This is a global issue. In order to take maximum advantage of what this technology can bring, we've got to work with all of the air navigation service providers, the other regulatory agencies, the other economic entities globally to make sure that this works. So industry does play a major part in this thing. It's not going to all be up to the government or FAA to move the needle.
Thanks. There's a question that's been there, and there's a ton of votes on it, so we need to get to that one. And it is the top one, and it's with most of aviation navigation is via GPS satellites and the decommissioning of land-based vortex. what is the backup plan for solar flares affecting our satellites? And I think there's a few people that can answer this on here, or at least get to an answer. So let's start with Eric. Do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the solar flares on the GPS, but I know that we're replenishing, the opportunity is there to replenish the GPS satellites at a more reasonable cost than when they originally went up, as the price of launches are going down. I mean, the price of launches are going down exponentially, I should say. You know, those original ones went up probably about $150 million or more per launch. Now they can get those same satellites up there for about $62 million. So cost savings, but I guess you guys may know a little more about that on the satellite side.
It's about that number,
yeah.
For our launches. SpaceX is very effective, but let me get to the question here. I mean, so I'll speak from the Aireon position. First of all the equipment is radiation hardened. I mean, you build, you know, to space grade specifications, so you start from that position, right? Where we're located, 480 miles above the Earth, it's, you know, they call those lower Earth orbit, and it's under what's called a Van Allen belt, right? So it's kind of like this belt around the Earth that essentially is a shield from the solar flares. And so for our equipment, we don't expect to really have any outages due to solar flares. And I'm not saying this just from a you know, theoretical perspective. Iridium launched their satellites in the end of the 90s. They've got 20 years of operations, and they have not experienced solar flare outages. They did have a satellite collide into one of their satellites, but that was a different story, right? And believe it or not, they actually have the ability to detect when that's going to occur, and we can move our satellite out of position and put it back into position to avoid it. So there is a satellite collision avoidance system that actually operates in space. So, but that's my understanding. You know, I don't know about satellites outside of the Van Allen belt. I'm assuming they're experiencing some level of outages or degradation.
So from a technology development standpoint, the systems that we're working on, one of the major premises that we assume is that at some point in time, these vehicles are going to have to operate in a GPS-denied environment, whether it's some kind of natural phenomenon or some other mechanical breakdown of the system. From a backup standpoint, we're looking at technological solutions to those scenarios. The implementation or integration of high levels of machine learning, artificial intelligence, even hearkening back to things like inertial navigation as backup, are all being considered as mitigators to the situation where you do face a GPS denied situation. Fortunately, GPS has been pretty reliable, and obviously it would remain primary, but it's a very valid question and one that we have to consider.
Thank you. There's another good question up here, and I think Vinny kind of touched on it a little bit, talking about public-private partnerships. And if there's so much money in commercial space, why wouldn't those profiting companies be required to help our outdated equipment become updated to allow better service for them, the customer of the system we are accommodating?
It's a great question. And I want to remind everyone what Lori said, we are still the Chihuahuas. So I talk about all this money coming into the industry, and I think it's big money. Last year, there was about $3.2 billion invested in commercial space companies. I think that's fantastic. When you think of the larger pie, it's small potatoes. However, the money that is being invested in the commercial space industry, they're putting that money right on the field. They're building these new technologies. A company that you probably never heard of, Vector Space, just on Friday announced that they raised $70 million to develop this small launch system. So it's coming in those tranches of money. But what I would say is that there are tools available out there, and as you just mentioned about the collision avoidance systems, that's the world I came from before this, a software company that develops space situational awareness tools, collision avoidance, proximity operations. Those same tools that are used in space can be used, in air traffic management systems, space traffic management. And it's a matter of that the government needs to react to the speed of industry and work with the speed of industry, not the speed of government. And I think that's a challenge that we see. But there are tools, and we are trying to get those tools into the system. But what you see a lot of these billionaires out there, and they get a name because they want to get themselves out there. But they're taking their money and putting it into the products that we're developing. And that's why we're seeing a record number of new systems being implemented and they're going to be launching within the next year.
And I'll add that we are a we, and so this is the kind of question we, in my view, need to think about a different paradigm. So, of course, commercial space and UAVs and airlines all need to pay their share. But if the NAS is a federal resource, we need to be getting federal investment. And if we do it together, and they want to incentivize, Dan Elwell's gone, we can pick on him, they want to say that they're doing all this. To Trish's point, appropriations need to follow authorizations, theoretically. If the pilots, if all the people who work on these programs, including some of the superstars, came to Washington before the appropriations vote, we might be able to do better. We have to work together. We often love, when I first came to the aviation community, the airport people are so fun to me. There's more women who run airports, it turns out, than pilots. So I'd be hanging out with them at the bar, and they're just bitching about the airlines. Like, basically if they weren't there, our lives would be a lot easier. Oh, okay, so you wouldn't have a reason to exist, but sure, life would be easier. If we didn't have to manage a resource, it's a managed public resource, the NAS. So somebody's going to find a way to go into it. We need to find a way to manage it, and that's public good, in my view. While those companies who are making money and are returning economic benefit to the nation will certainly, whether you believe in a modernized system that is privatized, so you pay user fees, we can get into the battle of, certainly we will, of who pays for what. But I think the driver has to be, we want the safe operations in the NAS. And if we aren't going to stifle new innovation, we've got to pay for that as a public service.
Vinny.
Yeah, a comment, I guess. 2 points. One was, we're a startup. We went on the street and got the loans, and we've invested $500 million. We haven't earned revenue yet. Right? We're still deploying. So there's a lot of risk that gets taken. It's a great question because, yes, we would love to be in this position of rolling in the profits and giving it back to the industry. And what's interesting about the question for me is I'm dealing with 11 other air navigation service providers around the world who have to get regulatory approval for the increase that they're going to charge for flying in their airspace. And once they get through that process, more than, I think, 10 of them are not for profit. So anything that's made out of this goes back into the system. So they keep their system modernized through those dollars. So any profit made from this entity, and by the way, our companies, our investors there are 5 air navigation service providers that are investors in this company. So, and Iridium is the only non-ANSP. So there's 6 investors in our company. So clearly they saw something goodness. But they have to go through that same regulatory approval, and the airlines sit on those decision bodies, and they participate in how they set the fees, and they have to balance their books. They can't just keep increasing the fees. They have to take something out when you put something in, and so there is the balance of the books along with safety. And it's done in a very intentional way. So I think the models are different and probably challenge what we're trying to do here. And from the federal government perspective, I know Aireon attempted to come to the FAA and ask if they wanted to be an investor, not understanding how the federal government works in the United States. And it can't be done. You can't invest in a company. You can award a contract. You could try to work out deals where you could lower the rates because they're a preferred customer. But there's no ownership capability in this current structure.
Thanks. try to get one more question here before we wrap up, but for Paul, we'll just take the number one voted on question. Without accurate altitude readouts for UAS, how are the drone pilots supposed to remain between 365 feet and under 400 feet required by current FAA regulations and the ruling in US versus Cosby?
Yeah, that's a great question, and not an easy one to answer. Most, if not all, systems that are out there right now rely very heavily on GPS altitude, and we know that there are some inaccuracies in that. It is not the traditional way that you're used to managing air traffic with barometric altimetry. So it is a challenge. There's another panel coming up right after this one on UAS, and when you talk about operations in that 365 foot to 400 foot area, that is the kind of the definition of UTM, the UAS traffic management volume of airspace where the smaller systems operate. I know that, and I won't steal anyone's thunder, but in the design construct of UTM, there's actually provisions for a buffer between 400 and 500 feet to accommodate some of those inaccuracies. Whether that survives or not is still TBD. The kinds of things that our company's interested in obviously are in larger platforms that are operating in that transition space between what is the current UTM definition and traditional terminal and en route operations. These are larger vehicles that are capable of carrying traditional altimetry solutions, both barometric and GPS, where the expectation is that the accuracy would be consistent with what you would expect on a certified manned IFR aircraft. The smaller consumer-grade drones that are operating in that UTM space from the surface to 400 feet, slightly different story. But that, you know, there are obviously risk mitigators in that plan, and I think it's appropriate to save that discussion for the next panel.
Thanks. We have a short presentation after this panel, so I would ask you to remain seated, but I wanted to kick it back over to Hassan and kind of close things out before we go.
No, I think this was just absolutely very interesting, lively discussion on all these technologies and the way forward. Our time is short, but you know, if there is one thing that could be done, you know, in the near term to advance these, I was wondering if I could just throw it out just for a couple of you guys to maybe talk about what would that one thing be, Eric?
Continuing the partnership, working with the aviation community, and the education process of understanding how we deal with the airspace and how you deal with the airspace. It's been a great education for me this past year because of the ARC, and I think continuing that dialogue and communication and funding.
Anybody else? Paul, just
yeah, I would agree with that. The other major void is the availability of operational data. A lot of work being done to fix that problem, collecting data, analyzing it, and using it to help in the risk assessments going forward for sustained operations. The unmanned aircraft safety team, particularly that was recently formed by FAA, is a great first step, modeled after the GHASC, the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee. Great stuff. It's a very important element that we need to continue to address.
So education's foundational to our country, and we need a pipeline of educated people coming up through the ranks to take this on and to build the future. You know, I don't have that much more time left, so I look at it as, you know, I want to see the pipeline behind me and what they're coming up with and what their innovations are going to be, and how they're going to attack the problem differently.
Trish?
Sure. I think I heard your question because it reverberates up here a little bit and you can't quite get it. But I certainly am, collaboration and communication are the two key pieces. It is a trying time for us specifically as we get different policies coming out of the administration that is kind of pulling a workforce away from their management counterparts and collaboration at a time when we need to do more collaboration. So that is a challenge and certainly something that we need to continue to strive to do even despite those policy issues.
Okay. Lori, just quick.
Continuing the theme of collaboration. I think we add to that the message of the importance and value of the system that we have and how incredibly safe and reliable it is. People have lost sight of this and utilize the opportunity of these new entrants to say, well, sure, they can come along when we have the tools to allow them to integrate safely. Until then, sorry, segregation.
Last word to Kelvin.
Yeah, I think the key challenge going forward is keeping pace with the industry demands, making sure that we have the appropriate investment, the appropriate appropriations to bring the necessary tools online, that we have the workforce in place that are properly trained to manage these operations as they come online. And again, I think the challenge really is to not when or if, but how do we integrate these operations safely into the National Airspace System.
And thank you, and that brings this segment to close. Please join Steve and I in thanking our panel this morning for a great conversation.
So with that, I would like to invite Vinny Capezzuto up to the podium, and everybody else, the rest of the panel can exit.
Which podium?
You can go right here. Uh-oh.
So, you know, there's a, as you build those highways in the skies to the highways in space, right? I think one of the honors in our, you know, in our community is to name a fix, right? To have a fix named after someone, or NATCA. So Aireon can't do that, but what Aireon can do is they've put a nameplate on one of our satellites, Space Vehicle 129, that has NATCA's name on it. So Space Vehicle 129, I think it's over Iceland, somewhere around Iceland, about dead center. And so you can see that's actual data coming off the satellites. That's live. I think Lori said earlier it'd be a big black blob over the U.S. It is a big black blob over the U.S. That's the traffic you see right now. So that's what we're seeing from space. I'd like, you know, Paul and Trish to come up and accept this plaque that you know, represents the nameplate that was put on there, and you know, the leadership that comes from NATCA and the patience you guys have shown us in believing in what we're doing has been phenomenal, and we definitely appreciate all the strategic advice we get from you both. So thank you very much.
That's pretty awesome. Thank you. Can I take a picture?
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.